Have you ever found yourself standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over a vast canyon, and felt something stir within you? That inexplicable urge to raise your hands, to shout into the void, to acknowledge something greater than yourself? Throughout human history, people have felt this call to worship when faced with the grandeur of creation. But here's something fascinating. Did you know that ancient Hebrew worship was nothing like the quiet, reserved services many of us experience today? In the ancient Near East, to worship meant to physically prostrate oneself before a superior. It was loud. It was demonstrative. It was communal. The question that intrigues me most is, what might we be missing in our modern understanding of worship? The answer, I believe, lies in one of the most vibrant calls to worship ever penned, Psalm 95. It's 1446 BCE. The Israelites have been wandering in the desert for decades. Every day is a struggle for survival. Water is scarce, food must be gathered daily, and the promised land seems like a distant dream. In this context, a song emerges, not a melancholy dirge, but an enthusiastic invitation to worship. This song would eventually become what we know as Psalm 95. While we can't definitively date Psalm 95, many biblical scholars attribute it to the time of King David, around 1000 BCE, when the collected psalms were being organized into the temple liturgy. The psalm was likely used during feast days when worshippers would gather at the temple in Jerusalem, creating a joyful noise as they ascended the Temple Mount. Psalm 95 belongs to a group known as the Royal Psalms, or Enthronement Psalms, Psalms 93 to 99, which celebrate God's kingship over all creation. This particular psalm serves as an invitation to the congregation to enter into God's presence with the right attitude, joyful thanksgiving, but also reverent submission. The structure of Psalm 95 is fascinating. The first 5 verses are a call to jubilant worship, filled with enthusiasm and celebration. Then, there's a dramatic shift in tone, as the final 6 verses deliver a solemn warning based on Israel's historical failures. This 2-part structure makes it particularly powerful as a teaching tool. Let me take you through this ancient call to worship that still resonates with millions today. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. This opening verse immediately establishes the communal nature of Hebrew worship. Notice it doesn't say, "Go and worship," or "You should worship." It says, "Let us," an invitation to join together. The Hebrew word for sing here is ranan, which means to cry out with a loud voice or shout for joy. This wasn't meant to be a quiet, reserved activity. The ancient Hebrews understood worship as a full-bodied, emotional expression. The metaphor of God as the rock of our salvation would have been particularly meaningful to the Israelites, who had witnessed water flowing from a rock during their desert wanderings in Exodus 17, around 1446 BCE. This rock literally saved them from dying of thirst in the desert. The imagery suggests stability, reliability, and life-giving power, something unmovable and trustworthy in an uncertain world. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. The Hebrew concept of thanksgiving, or toda, was far more than a feeling of gratitude. It involved specific thanksgiving offerings and public declarations of God's goodness. When the psalm says to come before him, it's using language of royal court protocol. Imagine approaching a king's throne. There were proper ways to enter the sovereign's presence. This reminds the worshippers that they are approaching the King of Kings. The mention of music and song reflects the robust musical tradition in ancient Hebrew worship. By the time of King David, around 1010 to 970 BC, the worship at the tabernacle and later the temple included a full orchestra and trained singers. 1 Chronicles 23 verse 5 tells us that David appointed 4,000 musicians for the temple services, playing instruments like lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets. Worship was a multi-sensory experience. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. This verse establishes the supremacy of Yahweh. The ancient world was full of polytheistic religions, with many surrounding nations worshipping multiple deities. The Canaanites had Baal and Asherah, the Philistines had Dagon, the Egyptians had Ra, Osiris, and dozens more. But the psalm writer declares that Yahweh is not just one God among many. He is the supreme God, the king above any other supposed deity. During the time of Moses and the Exodus, around 1446 to 1406 BC, the Israelites had repeatedly been tempted to worship other gods, creating the golden calf at Mount Sinai and later adopting Canaanite worship practices. This declaration serves as a reminder of the first commandment: "You shall have no other gods before me." In his hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. These verses establish God's authority through creation. In ancient Near Eastern mythology, different gods controlled different domains: a storm god, a sea god, a fertility goddess, and so on. But Psalm 95 declares that one God controls it all: the depths of the earth, the mountain heights, the sea, and the land. This countered the fragmented view of divine power common in surrounding cultures. The Hebrew word for hand, used here, yad, appears more than 1,600 times in the Old Testament and symbolizes power, ownership, and control. By saying these vast domains are in his hand, the psalm is painting a picture of God casually holding the entire universe in his palm, a vivid image of divine sovereignty. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Here we see the physical posture of ancient worship. The Hebrew terms used here, shacha, bow down, and kara, kneel, describe specific bodily positions that expressed humility and submission. In the ancient Near East, subjects would prostrate themselves before kings. This physical demonstration acknowledged the power differential between ruler and subject. The metaphor shifts to a pastoral one, from king to shepherd, from subjects to sheep. This dual imagery was common in ancient Near Eastern cultures, where kings often described themselves as shepherds of their people. In fact, the famous Babylonian king Hammurabi, who lived around 1792 to 1750 BC, referred to himself as a shepherd in the prologue to his famous legal code. This metaphor emphasizes both authority and care, the protection and provision a shepherd provides for vulnerable sheep. Now, at verse 7, the psalm takes a dramatic shift in tone, from joyful invitation to solemn warning. Today, if only you would hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. The word today creates urgency. The invitation to worship requires an immediate response. Biblical scholars note that the author of Hebrews in the New Testament quotes this section extensively in chapters 3 and 4, written around 64 to 70 CE, emphasizing the continued relevance of this urgent call. The psalm references two specific historical events, Meribah and Massah, names given to locations where the Israelites complained about lack of water during their wilderness wanderings. The incident occurred around 1446 BC and is recorded in Exodus 17 verses 1 to 7. The place was named Massah, testing, because they tested God, and Meribah, quarreling, because they quarreled with Moses. This reference would have been immediately recognizable to the original audience. It would be like a modern preacher saying, "Don't be like those who ignored the warnings at Pearl Harbor," a cultural touch point that immediately evokes a particular failure with known consequences. For 40 years, I was angry with that generation. I said, "They are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways." So I declared on oath in my anger, "They shall never enter my rest." The 40 years refers to the period of wilderness wandering from approximately 1446 to 1406 BC. After the Israelites refused to enter the Promised Land due to fear of its inhabitants, God decreed that the entire generation of adults, except for Joshua and Caleb, would die in the wilderness. This historical judgment provides the warning that caps the psalm. The concept of God's rest is multi-layered in Scripture. In its immediate context, it referred to the promised land of Canaan, where the Israelites could settle after centuries of slavery and decades of nomadic wandering. But it also carries spiritual connotations of peace and security in relationship with God. The author of Hebrews expanded on this concept around 64 to 70 CE, suggesting that this rest ultimately refers to salvation and eternal communion with God. What makes this psalm so powerful is this juxtaposition, the joyful invitation followed by the stern warning. It's like a parent saying, "Come, enjoy this feast I've prepared," and then adding, "But remember what happened to your brother when he refused to come." The joy is genuine, the invitation is sincere, but the consequences of refusal are real. The structure teaches us that proper worship includes both celebration and solemn reflection, both joy and reverence. The ancient Hebrews understood something that we sometimes forget, that approaching the divine is both the most joyful and the most serious activity a human can engage in. So what does this ancient call to worship mean for us today? In our fragmented, individualistic society, Psalm 95 reminds us that worship is meant to be communal. "Let us" appears repeatedly. The Hebrew language itself reinforces this. The word "you" in these verses is plural, not singular. Worship was never intended to be a solo activity. The psalm also challenges our often passive approach to worship. The verbs are active and vigorous: sing, shout, come, bow, kneel. The ancient Hebrews understood worship as something that engaged the entire person, mind, emotions, and body. In many modern settings, we've reduced worship to mental assent or emotional response, forgetting the physical dimension entirely. Perhaps most importantly, Psalm 95 reminds us that worship isn't optional. The warning in the second half makes clear that refusing to respond to God's invitation has consequences. The generation that hardened their hearts missed the promised land entirely. The Hebrew word for harden, kasha, means to make stubborn or obstinate, suggesting a willful resistance rather than mere indifference. Archaeological findings from Kadesh Barnea, the site where the Israelites camped when they refused to enter Canaan around 1445 BC, have revealed evidence of extended encampment, confirming the biblical account of their prolonged stay in the wilderness. The consequences described in this psalm were real, historical events. The beauty of this psalm lies in its balance. It doesn't present God as merely a jovial friend or a severe judge. He is both the one who invites joyful songs and the one who judges hardened hearts. He is both king and shepherd, both creator and redeemer. This balanced view prevents the extremes that can arise when we emphasize one attribute of God over others. The historical context of Psalm 95 reminds us that it emerged from a community that had experienced both God's provision and His discipline. The Israelites had witnessed the plagues in Egypt around 1446 BC, experienced the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, received manna daily in the wilderness, and seen water flow from a rock. But they had also faced the consequences of their rebellion: 40 years of wandering, punishment for idol worship, and attacks from enemy nations. Interestingly, the placement of Psalm 95 in the Hebrew Psalter is also significant. It appears among the royal psalms, 93 to 99, that emphasize God's kingship. It serves as a gateway to these psalms, preparing the worshipper's heart to acknowledge divine sovereignty. Biblical scholars note that the organization of the psalms was intentional, with themes and motifs carefully arranged to create a progression of spiritual understanding. The psalm uses the covenant name of God, Yahweh, translated as Lord, in most English Bibles, emphasizing the personal relationship between God and His people. This wasn't worship of a distant, impersonal force, but recognition of a God who had entered into a covenant relationship with Israel at Mount Sinai around 1446 BCE. The name Yahweh, revealed to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3, was so sacred that the Israelites eventually avoided pronouncing it altogether. The theological richness of Psalm 95 has made it a cornerstone of liturgical worship for thousands of years. In the Jewish tradition, it became part of the Kabbalah Shabbat service that welcomes the Sabbath on Friday evenings. In Christian tradition, it was incorporated into morning prayers as early as the 4th century CE. The Latin version, known as the Venite, has been sung at daybreak in monasteries for over 1,500 years. In the 16th century, during the Protestant Reformation, reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin emphasized the importance of congregational participation in worship. Calvin, in particular, advocated for psalm singing as the purest form of musical worship. This led to the development of metrical psalms, poetic versions of the psalm set to singable tunes. Psalm 95 was among the most frequently adapted, with dozens of musical settings created during the Reformation period, 1517 to 1648. English poet John Donne, writing in the early 17th century, created a famous meditation on Psalm 95, describing it as a psalm of invitation to praise God, an invitation to a communion, a communication of His graces. This captures the essence of the psalm, not just praise for its own sake, but praise as a means of connecting with the divine. What's remarkable is how a text written approximately 3,000 years ago continues to speak to fundamental human experiences. We still feel small when standing before natural wonders. We still struggle with hardened hearts and resistance to divine guidance. We still need both the joy of celebration and the sobriety of warning. Psalm 95 teaches us that authentic worship begins with recognition of who God is, Creator, King, Shepherd, and who we are in relation to Him, His people, His flock, dependent on His care. This recognition naturally leads to both joyful expression and humble submission. The psalm doesn't set these responses against each other, but presents them as complementary aspects of true worship. The warning section reminds us that worship isn't merely a weekend activity, but a life orientation. The Israelites who complained at Meribah had seen God's miraculous provision, yet they still doubted His goodness when facing the next challenge. Their failure wasn't lack of attendance at religious services, but a fundamental heart orientation that refused to trust despite evidence of God's faithfulness. Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, in his 2014 book, From Whom No Secrets Are Hid, describes Psalm 95 as a liturgical script that invites, authorizes, and hosts a different kind of reality. This captures the transformative power of this ancient call to worship. It doesn't just invite us to sing songs. It invites us to enter a different reality, one where God is King, where history has meaning, and where our response matters eternally. The psalm uses the Hebrew literary device of parallelism, where ideas are expressed in pairs or triplets with similar structures. For example, let us sing, let us shout, and let us bow down, let us kneel. This repetition creates rhythm and emphasis, driving home the central message. It's a technique that makes the psalm more memorable and impactful for listeners. The references to creation in verses 4 to 5 connect with a creation account in Genesis 1, written around 1400 BCE. By emphasizing God's creative power, the psalm reinforces the foundational Jewish belief that the material world is not eternal or self-existent, but was brought into being by divine will. This stands in stark contrast to many ancient creation myths from surrounding cultures, which often depicted the world emerging from conflicts between gods or from pre-existing matter. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed that mountain worship was common among Israel's neighbors. The Canaanites, for instance, built high places for Baal worship. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh on Mount Nebo. By declaring that the mountain peaks belong to him, Psalm 95 was directly challenging these competing religious claims. It was a theological statement with political implications in the ancient world. The shepherd imagery in verse 7 builds on a metaphor that runs throughout Scripture, from Abel, the first shepherd mentioned in Genesis 4, to Jesus' self-identification as the Good Shepherd in John 10. In the ancient Near East, around 1000 BCE, when David likely wrote many psalms, shepherding was a common occupation, but also a royal metaphor. Kings were expected to shepherd their people with justice and care. By using this imagery, the psalm emphasizes both God's authority and His compassionate guidance. What's particularly striking about Psalm 95 is how it connects the dots between creation, history, and worship. The God who deserves our praise is both the Creator who formed the mountains and seas, and the covenant God who acted in Israel's history. This prevented worship from becoming either too abstract, focused only on cosmic power, or too parochial, focused only on tribal identity. The warning about hardened hearts uses the metaphor of hardening that would have been familiar to an agricultural society. Just as soil can become hardened and unreceptive to seed, the human heart can become closed to divine influence. This agricultural metaphor also appears in Jesus' parables some 1,000 years later, around 30 CE, particularly in the parable of the sower. The final verse's reference to "my rest" connects to the Sabbath rest established at creation. Just as God rested on the seventh day after creating the world, He promised a place of rest for His people. This creates a beautiful theological symmetry. The God who rested after creation offers rest to His creation. The concept of divine rest as a gift to humanity appears at both the beginning of the biblical narrative, Genesis 2, and at its end, Revelation 14 verse 13. The phrase, "if you hear his voice," in verse 7 emphasizes the personal, communicative nature of God in Hebrew theology. Unlike the silent idols of surrounding nations, Yahweh spoke through creation, through prophets, through the law, and through the human conscience. This capacity for divine human communication is a distinctive feature of Judeo-Christian theology that sets it apart from many other religious traditions of the ancient world. The specific mention of 40 years in verse 10 would have resonated powerfully with the original audience. 40 is a significant number in biblical narrative, often associated with testing or preparation. Noah's flood lasted 40 days. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Elijah traveled 40 days to Horeb. Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness. The number suggests a complete period of testing or preparation. As we conclude our exploration of this ancient call to worship, I invite you to consider, how might your approach to worship change if you embraced both the joyful celebration and the reverent submission that Psalm 95 describes? What would it mean to truly hear his voice today? In a world that often reduces worship to either emotional experiences or intellectual assent, Psalm 95 calls us to something more comprehensive, a whole person response to the God who created us, sustains us, guides us, and invites us into relationship with him. It reminds us that worship isn't primarily about what we get from it, but about who God is and who we are in relation to him. The enduring power of this psalm lies in its ability to connect us with worshipers across thousands of years, from the ancient Israelites ascending to the temple in Jerusalem, to medieval monks chanting the Venite at daybreak, to congregations around the world today. When we respond to its call, we join our voices with a great cloud of witnesses who have found that true joy comes in recognizing and submitting to the King above all gods, the rock of our salvation. The invitation of Psalm 95 still stands. Come! Come with joy. Come with reverence. Come today. The choice is yours, to hear his voice or to harden your heart, to enter his rest or to remain restless, to join the joyful song or to remain silent. What will your response be? Before you go, I want to personally invite you to be part of our growing community here at Prayer Universe. If this video touched your heart or brought you peace, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a prayer or message that can uplift your spirit. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, share just one word or phrase of motivation that this video inspired in you, whether it's hope, gratitude, peace, or something else. Your words matter deeply to us because they help guide the content we create for this channel. Together, let's build a space filled with faith, encouragement, and connection. Thank you for being here, and remember, every prayer counts. See you in the next one.